All right, so this is Vinicio Cinta. Today is January 6th, 2017, and we are here to do an interview with Dr. Maggie Rivas-Rodriguez for the Voces Oral History Project. We are at the University of Texas at Austin in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Dr. Rivas-Rodriguez, for granting us this interview.
You're quite welcome.
So we're going to start by talking about why did you go into journalism? Why did you become a journalist?
Well, when I was a kid, when I was growing up, the only one thing that I could do was I was a writer. So even when I was little tiny, and I always kept diaries, and I would write short stories and poems and stuff. So that was my one skill that I had growing up. So I always envisioned myself a novelist. And when I came to UT Austin, I really fell into journalism, started doing a radio program, and then that led to working with the Daily Texan, and that led to me majoring in journalism.
So what triggered that shift from literature, from fiction to journalism?
To be honest, I did not really understand the options. Growing up in a small town in South Texas, my parents did get the San Antonio newspaper, and we watched the news in the evening. But I really didn't understand journalism as a career option. And I thought I would be a nurse because the only Mexican American woman that I knew who had a college degree was my cousin, Charo Bustamante, and she was a nurse. And so I thought, well, I guess that's what you do. You become a nurse. And so I was all set to become a nurse, but thinking that in the evenings I would write. So I really didn't, that was really the thing. And I think that that's an important, something that drives me with young people. If young people realize that journalism is an option, then they may gravitate toward it. And so once I realized that that was an option, that you could actually get paid to write and to interview people and to do research, then it was, a whole new world opened up to me.
And so you found that out in UT?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming, for example, in grade school or in middle school or high school, was there any school newspaper? Or?
We had a newspaper in high school, but it was a little mimeographed thing. And it wasn't really journalism. It was things like, so-and-so moved to town. And that was about the extent of it. I wouldn't call that journalism. But I did participate in UIL competitions. And I got some awards for my writing. There was something called Ready Writing. So I entered that, and I got awards for that. I placed in competitions for that. So that's why the writing part of it, that's the part that I knew I could do. That's the part that got reinforced with the contests. And so the contests became kind of another thing that I thought later on would be an important way to encourage young people to think about writing careers.
Okay. So you mentioned you came to UT, you got into the School of Journalism. So how was the School of Journalism back then? How do you remember it?
Well, the CMA had just been built on Whitus and 26th Street, and I was in that class in 1973, I guess the fall of 73 or 73. That was the first ones that started using that building. So it was, at the time, the facilities were brand new and they were really beautiful. Wayne Danielson was the dean at the time, and I took a class under him, a big class. So some of the same people were here. They taught broadcast out of a lab where you would actually have to splice the tape. You would record, not for video, but for audio tape. You'd learn how to splice tape and tape it together and stuff. So that's kind of the state of the art back then. And I took photojournalism, and I, under J.B., what is his last? Colton? J.B. Colton? That doesn't sound right, but I took photojournalism, and I really fell in love with it. So I started taking a lot of pictures, and they had a wet lab. So I spent more time in the wet lab learning how to develop and print pictures, and started thinking about making that my career. But it would have entailed me spending another year here, and I did not want to spend another year. I was ready to get out and start working.
And you also mentioned radio and the Daily Texan.
Yeah, so the radio thing just was really something that there used to be bulletin boards every place on campus. In some places there still are. In our building there aren't any. They've kind of outlawed bulletin boards, but there was a bulletin board with a flyer that said that the KUT was looking for some students to work on the Spanish language public affairs program. So KUT being the public broadcasting radio station, which was in the CMB at the time. And now it's over in the same Below Media Center where the journalism department is. So they had this flyer, and I responded to it. And so this man named Marcelo Tafoya had a 5-day-a-week radio program, and he hired me, Alicia Flores, and Alberto Flores to put this thing together, and Alicia Lopez. So what we did was it was really bad. It was called, I think the first one was called La Onda Chicana. And we would read the newspaper and magazines, and we would rewrite it into Spanish. And then we had a little cassette recorder. We'd sit in my room, my dorm room, and sit there and read it and tape it that way. And then we'd take that to him, and he would air it like that. So it was really bad because my Spanish was not very good. So I overheard these friends of mine one day saying, "Hey, did you listen to KUT last night? They had this Spanish language program. It was really bad." And it was really bad. But that was how I started. So I ended up doing La Onda Chicana, Mundo de Mujeres, and there was one more that escapes me right now. But I did 3 different programs over the course of my 3 years here at UT for Marcelo Tafoya. And then Marcelo hired me to do a little interview segment at KTBC. So there would be the television station. So I would interview people, and it would be in Spanish, and it would be about your taxes or something like that. So I would show up at the TV station, and we'd go in there, and these people that I'd be interviewing would be all freaked out. They'd be all nervous because there were lights and there were cameras, and they'd start sweating. I'd say, "Don't be nervous. It's just me and the camera and all these lights. It's going to be fine." So but I did that for about a year. So I started doing that. Then I started working at the Daily Texan. And so the Daily Texan, I was, at the time, when you took a class in journalism, one of the journalism classes would feed into the Daily Texan. So some of the best stories would appear in the Daily Texan. So I started getting bylines in the Daily Texan. And I thought that was Christmas morning. I'd get up and I'd see in the Daily Texan my byline about stories that I had come up with, or sometimes it was a press release they gave me. But I started kind of getting the knack of finding news pieces and finding stuff to report on. So it really came naturally to me. The whole journalism thing really came naturally to me. And once I got into it, I was totally committed to it, and I knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
So, can you recall a particularly interesting story or something that really, captured you, that you were really interested in covering?
Yeah, right away, one thing that, coming from the little town in South Texas, Divine, which was fairly segregated and had a lot of racial problems with Mexican Americans and whites. And so I came into UT with already kind of having that background and being very aware of that. And so I knew that reading the Daily Texan and starting to look at, and being a little bit more critical of the news media, I started to realize that the Latino part of this was missing. So one thing I started working on from the beginning was doing stories that other reporters who didn't have my background would find. And so I would propose these. And so they let me and a photographer go down to South Texas and do a story about farm workers. So I did that with a photographer, and I went to Houston with a bunch of other students. They had a women's, a Chicana organization. I don't know if it was an organization, but anyway, they had a big conference in Houston. So I went to cover that. And the Daily Texan was very open to me doing those stories. I never got the feeling that they were prejudiced that way. And in fact, I got a little one of the monthly awards they used to give for best feature on one of the stories that I did about the Mexican American community. So I found that there was a need for it, and so those were the stories that I really enjoyed working on.
How many Latinos were there at the School of Journalism and at the Daily Texan back then?
At the Daily Texan, there was me and there was a photographer whose name was Chaka, and I can't remember his last name. So we were the only ones that I remember at the Daily Texan. But in the School of Journalism, well, in the College of Communication, there were bastantitos. So even in, there were Alicia Lopez was one of my friends who was a journalism major. Alberto Flores was a journalism major. Ronnie Zamora from Brownsville was a journalism major. Letty Fernandez from Brownsville was also a journalist. So we actually had kind of a cohort of people, some a little bit older, some, a couple of years younger. But that's when we started kind of getting together and looking at what were some of the issues that we found. And so we found that there was not a lot of news about Latinos or Mexican Americans in the Daily Texan. And there was one issue that kept on coming up. At the time, there was some sort of tequila that they would sell. And the ad in the Daily Texan was of this sexy, sultry Mexican woman with a very low-cut blouse and large breasts advertising tequila. And we really found that offensive because we as Mexican Americans, it's kind of the only thing that we're known for is selling tequila, and the whole idea of the sexualized Latina was something that we're really opposed to, and so we tried to get them to change that. So there were stories like that. There was an absence of some stories. As I recall, there might have been some stories that appeared that were racist, but I can't really remember the particulars of that. But anyway, at the end of it, we got together, a group of us, Mexican Americans in the communication college, and we decided to have a conference. And so there's a woman named Irma Orozco, who was, I think she was a year younger than I was, and she was also I was a broadcast major. She was really the one who did most of the work on the conference, but I was very involved in it as well. And so there were a bunch of us. So we put together a 2-day conference. We held it at the Catholic Student Center. The dean, Wayne Danielson, gave us some money. I forget how much, and I don't know if we got. I think the Center for Mexican American Studies also gave us some money to hold the conference. So we brought in some speakers from different places. We brought in Felix Gutierrez, and that was the beginning of my really long relationship with Felix Gutierrez, who became my biggest mentor and remains a big mentor and hero to me to this day. So we had this conference. We planned out all the workshops, the panel discussions, really worked hard on doing it and tried to address some very serious issues. So one of the things that came out of this was the Houston, one of the Houston papers, at the time there used to be 2, there was a reporter, columnist named Tony Castro, and he wrote this nasty column about, here are all these college students doing a conference about what's going on and the problems with coverage of Mexican Americans. They should be taking care of their studies, and they should be working on that. And I was really angry about that. We were all very angry about that because we didn't ask anyone for anything besides the sponsorship. So we had gotten. We did this all on our own. It was all volunteer efforts, and we thought this was an important public service. And for him to be dismissive of us just because we were very young was really not to look at the issues that we were raising, but just to dismiss us just because of our ages. I was, to this day, I always think about that. And it's a good reminder for me now, because now I'm one of the older people, and now I see younger people wanting to do things. And I feel very strongly that we need to encourage them and really look at the issues they're raising, not so much as how they're saying it or the context of how they're putting this message together, but really analyzing, are they making a good point? Because I think that we made lots of really important points then.
Did the organizers of the conference reply to him in some way?
I don't recall because I don't think that we heard about it until, um, sometime after the thing was over.
So this is the Chicanos Interesados en
Yeah,
Comunicaciones group?
yeah, that was our name.
Did that lead to a permanent organization afterwards, after the conference?
That was my senior year, so I graduated after that. So I don't know that people, kept on organizing, but some of the same people that were involved in that organization ended up being involved in what became NHJ, many years later. That was 1975, 76, 75, 76.
Another related question. These were years that it was a time of there was a lot of campus activism, right before and during the early 70s. Did any of you in this group, for example, were involved in the Chicano movement as, for example, activists?
Well, here's the thing. It's because we were journalists, that made it a little bit uncomfortable for us. We took very much to heart. We were very serious journalists. I mean, we were not playing at journalism. We really looked at some of the issues, and I remember having arguments about what are you first, a Chicano or Chicana or a journalist? And we were very serious. To us, that was a big question to ask. And at the time, my response was, we have to be a Chicana first, because you can always change your profession and you can sell shoes, but you can't change your, what you are. And then, over the years, I've given a lot of thought to that, because it's kind of beside the point. I've never been needed to choose what I was first and foremost. A story is a news story, and because I was Chicana, I could still, or Mexican American or Latina, whatever I was calling myself at the time, a news story was a news story. And just because someone was of the same race, I didn't give them any special breaks. Like if somebody was doing something wrong, I wasn't going to say, oh, well, he's one of my patriots. I need to be extra nice to him. That's just not the way it works. You have to just let the chips fall where they may. So I followed that very, very seriously all my career.
And well, you mentioned questions of identity, Chicano, Latino, Latina. Were there any students of other Latin American origin, people with Cuban American, Puerto Rican heritage involved in this?
Not at the time. In the 1970s, we were Mexican American, and not even and at the time, really Mexican American, not Mexican immigrant Americans. But most of us had been of this group, the Chicanos Interesados en Comunicaciones. We were at least second or third generation Mexican American, and longer. But we were all working class too. That was the other part of it. Is I don't know that any one of us was middle class really. We really came from pretty working class roots. So the college thing, we were the first generation of our group that went to college for the most part.
So did any of you have any connections to the industry through the family? Journalism?
Oh no. We were, our fathers were barbers and mechanics and things like that.
So I was going to ask also about role models. You mentioned Professor Gutierrez. Did you look up to people in the industry, to particular journalists?
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, I think the reason I wanted to do broadcast journalism was there was a woman named Martha Buchanan, who was a television anchor in San Antonio. And she kind of looked Latina, to be honest. She had, dark hair and dark eyes, and I would watch her, and I thought, she just seemed so smart and so poised. I thought of her. She was kind of like somebody I would have, my first idea, I would like to emulate her. But then later on, as a journalist, when I started in college, there really were not, on the national scene, there were not a lot of people that I would look at and I'd say, I want to be like them. And probably because what I really was looking for was somebody who looked more like me. And, maybe that's superficial, but, when you're 19 or 20 years old, that's as far as you can really think of. So I didn't really have any role models like that for a long time. Then, I think later on, as you start to be more critical and thoughtful about what kind of journalism you want to practice, then you start looking at not so much the person, but you look at what the person is doing. And even if that person doesn't have it all figured out, even if they're not, they're really good about reporting on race issues, but they're leaving out the Mexican American or they're leaving out the Latino thing, you can still admire their work and say, I like that, I like this part of it, but the one hole in what they would do was they wouldn't include the Latino perspective, and that's something I would like to do. So I think that that's something that comes with a little bit of maturity.
Another thing I wanted to ask from back then, how was the situation with internships and other like pipelines to the industry?
That's a good question. So at the time, I'm not sure, I don't know how much this is true today. There weren't a lot of organized internships even then. So I did an internship at a radio station, but and I can't even remember what the radio station was, but it was really awful because I didn't learn anything. They basically just sat me there and they didn't know how to teach you to do anything. So it was a waste of time for me and for them. But then one thing I did want to do was I wanted to work in a newspaper in Mexico because I knew my Spanish was so bad and I wanted to improve it. So I was sitting next to Wayne Danielson, the dean, at a dinner. And so we started talking, and he says, well, what do you want to do? I said, what I really want to do is I want to do this internship in Mexico. So at the time, El Norte was owned by the Junco de la Vegas. And he said, well, 2 of our graduates have a newspaper down there. Would you like to do that? And Monterrey is where my mother's family is from. So I ended up doing an internship in Monterrey for a summer in 1975. And that was a great experience. I really did learn a lot. I learned a lot. My Spanish really improved, but I learned how to be in a newsroom, and I found it really exciting to be in a newsroom that way. So that was really fun. And I worked at the Daily Texan, and then when I was graduating, I got this internship at Exxon in the public relations department that paid very, very well. It paid at the time, it was like $1,000 a month, and I needed that because I was going to graduate school at Columbia. So I really needed the money. And so at the time, they had something like 6 internal magazines. And so that was what I did. And so I was able to use my photography, and I wrote stories about different people and stuff. And that was really fun. I mean, it wasn't, the PR part of it wasn't having to explain what Exxon is doing to people out there. It was more about, these are employees that are doing some good works in their various communities. So it was basically, I was writing feature stories, and it was a lot of fun.
Where was this?
In Houston.
In Houston.
Yeah, I lived in Houston for the summer.
So once you finished your degree here at UT, you went straight to Columbia, or was there like a space?
No, I went straight to Columbia. What had happened was, I had gotten to know the dean with the internship, and also he gave us money for that conference. And so one day I was walking across the plaza at the CMA, and he said, so Maggie, what are you going to do next year when you graduate? And I said, oh, I'm going to start working. And he said, oh, you should go to graduate school. I said, oh, no, Dean, I don't want to go to graduate school. I just want to start working. So he said, no, come up to my office. So he gave me the names of the 3 professional journalism programs. And one of them was USC, Northwestern, and Columbia. And so, and this is before the web, right? So you had to write off and get their stuff and then do everything on paper. So I got accepted to all 3, but the line from the Columbia Graduate School was, New York City is your laboratory. And that was a selling point. I thought, oh my gosh, I'd never been to New York City. I had read about New York City. So I thought this would be a really exciting place to go. So that's how I ended up deciding to go to Columbia. But it was really expensive. And so, trying to figure out how to get everything paid for was a challenge.
So how was the, I don't know if you can provide some details about your experience over there.
At Columbia? Oh, it was wonderful. I met some. There were some. There was another woman here, Teresa Costa, who was also going to study journalism up there. So she and I were in the same class. There were a couple of Puerto Rican students. There were some Cuban American students. So I started to know different people like that. One of my classmates was from Argentina, and he had a fellowship through the Inter-American Press Association. So he told me about that, which I ended up doing that fellowship later. Um, and I was able to, I had a chance to get really super edited by very serious editors. Up until this time, it was basically college level stuff. I would write it for the Daily Texan, and they wouldn't make too many changes, and it was all great, and you'd get a byline. And then at Exxon, I'm sure they massaged it, I'm sure they edited it, but it was different. It was, those were basically feature stories. So you go to Columbia, now you're working with some really hard-nosed journalists, and they're very, really tough. And so they edited you very, very seriously. So you had to really up your game. And so that was tough. It was really tough. But, you learned a lot. You learned a lot. And so I was really glad for that experience.
So going from Texas to a city like New York, where a lot of the industry is there, there's a lot of editing companies, publishers, but also with back then it already had a big Spanish language newspaper and other ethnic media. Did you become more acquainted over there with
Not
Latino?
really, not really. At the time, they didn't circulate around Columbia, and there were no Latinos on the faculty at all. I think there were two African American faculty members, but so I didn't really. That was like in a different world, and my world was really the J school. I was very, very focused on doing the work for my classes. The one really great thing was at the time the graduate school had a newspaper that they would put out once a week, and so I started working on that as part of my classwork, and started taking a lot more pictures and using some really great cameras, and so I kind of honed in a little bit on photography. But then I took a magazine class where I was able to write a story about Chicanos at Ivy League schools. And so it was kind of the same thing, that I was able to see that there were all kinds of stories out there that weren't getting reported. So at the time, Columbia did have undergraduates from Mexican American undergraduates. And so it was a really big story, because all these Ivy League schools were just trying to do this and trying to open up their doors, and they were having some real problems with the retention, because these poor kids would get there. They'd come up from El Paso or Eagle Pass or someplace like that. They'd go up there, and there would be nobody that spoke Spanish, nobody that looked like them. And so they would have, at Thanksgiving, they would have a big party. And so that's how I got to know a bunch of them.
Okay. Were you writing for any other publication at that moment?
No, but that magazine piece, I ended up freelancing it for the Dallas Morning News. And so the Dallas Morning News had a magazine, and so I sold it to them. I don't remember how much they paid me, but I'm sure they paid me a couple $100. And then I got to do my master's project was on Chilean refugees in New York. So it kind of, I was aware of the coup in Chile, but I started to, it's kind of one of those things that if you are looking, you just fall into these news stories. I was at Mass one Sunday night, and there was a request for anybody who could babysit for the Chilean refugees. And so I said, I'm not interested in babysitting, but I'm interested in learning more. And so that ended up being my master's project. So it was a really, really, it was a piece of a really important story. I'd love to go back and talk to those people and see what became of them.
All right. So, so what happened after the masters? You mentioned this. Can you remind me of the name in terms?
Well, first of all, I was going from New York back to Texas, right? And so I was going to take a Greyhound bus. And so my idea was I was going to take all these my resumes and my clips, and I was going to stop along the way at major markets and interview for a newspaper job. because by this time I didn't want to do broadcast anymore. Now I had a professor who hated broadcast, and he didn't think that it was very serious journalism, and so I was very impressionable, and so I ended up going back to print. So I was gonna. That's what my idea was. But if you've ever been on a Greyhound bus for about 4 hours, you realize you don't really feel like getting off the bus and presenting yourself with your clips and interviewing for a job. So I just took the Greyhound bus to Dallas, and in Dallas I had some friends of friends, relatives of friends, and they let me stay with them for a couple of days. And I interviewed for a job at the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times Herald, and one of my former Daily Texan contacts said, "You should go to UPI. They've been hiring a bunch of UT grads." So I went to UPI and I got a job there. So that was like, I interviewed with them on a Thursday. I got to Divine on the Friday morning. My suitcases were in the living room, and I get a phone call from UPI in Dallas saying, "If you're interested in a job, you need to let us know today, and you need to start on Monday." And so I called the newspapers and I said, "I just got offered a job. Do you guys have anything for me?" And they said no. And so it was like, okay, so that's my job. So just by happenstance, I ended up having a little bit of money in an account that I had forgotten about, a bank account. So I got a car, drove up to Dallas, and started a job on Monday at UPI. It was a copy editing job.
So how was UPI, at least in Dallas? How was the new newsroom? How big?
It was a fairly large newsroom. I guess there was about 20-something people, and it was just one large room with just a bunch of, at that time the desktop computers were pretty big, and there was one other Latino there, Ray Perez, and Silvia Moreno, who had by this time had left UPI, and I don't remember if she went to the Washington Post right away or where she had gone, but she became a friend of mine much later, but she had just gone through there, and so she worked there before me. So I did that for a year and 9 months, and then I had applied for that fellowship to South America, but I didn't want it right away. I wanted to wait a little bit, but they ended up calling me and saying, writing to me and saying, "You got this fellowship to go to Peru," and so it's kind of okay. So I ended up doing that. I ended up going to Peru and being there for 9 months with my younger sister. She went with me. So did that for 9 months, had to write just one story a month, traveled around the southern cone of South America, met up with the families of some of the people I had interviewed in New York for my master's project, and really expanded my worldview. So I always tell my students, travel is one of the best things you can do to educate yourself, because if I had stayed in Divine, Texas, I would have thought the world was like Divine, Texas. If I had come up to Austin and not gone to New York, same thing. So over and over again, my world has kept on getting expanded.
So these stories that you were writing, where were they going? Where were they published?
I would send them to the IAPA office in Miami, and then they would distribute them, and I have no idea what method they used, but they would distribute them to their members. That I don't know what stories got published and which didn't. I just know of one that got published in a place called Yungay that had been basically demolished by a mudslide after an earthquake there. And so that one story, that was actually, I freelanced that one to the Boston Globe. So one thing that happened before, when I was working at UPI in Dallas, I had gone up to Chicago for a conference right at the beginning about diversity in the news media. And the question, and it was organized by the Gannett Foundation, and they said, the big question was, how do we get more Latinos into, or Hispanics into the news media? That was the big question. That was 1970, graduated in 77, I think it was 78, 77 or 78. So this was in Chicago. So we're at this thing, and Felix Gutierrez is the one who had gotten me there. So I was the one Hispanic. There were 3 Asian Americans, and then there was about 20 African Americans. And so after this conference, after this thing is over, there's panel discussions, and people are trying to wrap their heads around this. Lots of editors. Then the African American journalists got together, and they were kind of, and I remember this as being some kind of room. They were all kind of sitting, and they were all talking to each other, and the Asian American journalists and myself were kind of like on the outskirts of this. And so they're talking about what we need to do and we need to do. And I said, well, how about us? And they said, one of them turned around and says, well, what about you? And I said, well, we're not African American. And they said, well, go start your own organization. And it made me really angry at the time. But after I got over being angry, I realized he was right. We did need to start our own organization. So the NAHJ thing kind of goes back to that.
So on that same topic, were you a member of any journalist organizations in your early career?
No, and you know, the journalists organizations were like SPJ. They were not very active when I was in college. And then when I was at UPI, UPI was kind of like, it was a real, almost like a grind. You would basically go there and work all day, and there was not much room for much else besides that. So there was not much, they did have a softball team and stuff like that, but there wasn't a lot of room for kind of professional development type stuff. So no, I didn't belong to any other organizations.
And talking about this specific conference about diversity, so what solutions were people talking about?
I don't recall. I do not recall, but I'm sure that the Gannett Foundation, I'm sure that they have that somewhere in their files.
So did at that point, did you start networking with other people who wanted to create a Latino organization?
Well, at the time I was in Dallas, and I was working at UPI, and for some part of that I was working an overnight shift, which means I'd start at 10 o'clock in the morning and get off at 6 in the morning. So I didn't really hang out with too many. I did start to meet other people. I met Robert Montemayor, who became a good friend later on. He was working at the Dallas Times-Herald. And I met Maria Newman, who was a student at SMU, and Robert and I and another guy named Victor Solis, who ended up being he was a television reporter in Dallas. We were on a panel discussion together. So, you know, there were always little panel discussions. Every place I went, there seemed to be panel discussions. There was an interest, and people were aware that this was an issue. So even SMU had a little panel discussion where they invited the three of us in to talk about issues.
So going back, so you returned from Peru?
So I was at this conference in Chicago. I met an editor with the Boston Globe named Sal Michike. Sal Michike came over, and I remember I was drinking orange juice, and he said, "Maggie, how would you like to come to the Boston Globe?" And I said, "And be what?" And he said, "Be a copy editor." I said, "Sal, I'm a copy editor in Dallas. Why would I move to Boston to be a copy editor? But if you told me come up to be a reporter, now that's different." He said, "Oh, no, not a reporter. You know, our reporters, it's like you have to really work in different places to work to get a job as a reporter at the Morning News, at the Boston Globe." And I said, okay, that was it. So then I'm working in Dallas, and so I'm working the overnight shift, and I get a call from the Boston Globe that this other editor for the Boston Globe named Jack Driscoll was going to be in town and wanted to have dinner with me. So I picked him up at his hotel and took him out to dinner, and so he starts asking me all these questions, and and I'm just being friendly. I think this is nice. This is a nice editor talking to me, and he's asking me all these questions, and he asks me what I want to do, and I really wanted to be a reporter. I mean, the fact is, I got the first job I could get, and that was as copy editor, and I was learning a lot. You know, working as a copy editor is great training to be a reporter because you start finding holes in people's stories. So then later, Jack Driscoll calls me, and I guess it was Sal. Sal calls me and says that they want me to come up for an interview at the Boston Globe. I'm still working in Dallas. And in the meantime, I found out about this fellowship. So I was going to New York anyway for vacation, and I was going to meet some friends. So I go up to Boston, and they interview me for a job. And I said, "I really am very interested in coming here and working as a reporter, but I have this fellowship to South America. So can I get this job after I come back?" And they said, well, you know, how long are you going to be gone? I'll be gone 9 months. Well, we can't make any guarantees, so, you know, sorry. And I said, okay, well, that's okay. I knew somewhere inside me, I knew that there would not be too many times in my life when I would have a chance to do something like this. Take off for 9 months. Travel like this for 9 months. And I really wanted this reporting job, but I also knew that, you know, there was a chance I could get a reporting job later on. I had a feeling I'd never be able to do something like that, you know, that fellowship again. So that's how we left it. So I went to South America, took a leave of absence from UPI, went to South America, and when I was there, the Boston Globe called me and said I had a job waiting for me. So the leave of absence turned into, you know, I resigned from UPI in Dallas. So I've got to say, you know, I guess part of me feels a little bit guilty that I resigned because I was supposed to go back. That was the idea. That was my commitment. But UPI had not treated me very well, only in terms of there was some office politics going around, and I was the youngest one in the newsroom. And so there was this one editor who had been a real jerk to me. So instead of kind of like defending me to this jerk of an editor, they had basically said, you know, very, very long story short, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but bottom line is I didn't feel the loyalty from my supervisors there. When they should have stood up to me, they didn't stand up for me. So I didn't feel guilty saying, you know, never mind, I'm not going to do it. So that's how that happened. So anyway, they said, yeah, you have a job waiting for you. So I was really excited. Came back, same thing, took a Greyhound bus. And I told my younger sister who had been with me, come up with me to Boston. She wanted to go back to school. I said, come up with me to Boston and you get a job. You can go to school in Boston. So we took a Greyhound bus up to Boston, and they put me up at a really nice hotel for, I don't know, 2 weeks or something before I could find a place, and then started working there.
So what were you covering? What were your...
I was general assignment, you know, and they didn't tell me this when I interviewed for the job, but they were looking for a Hispanic reporter. So my first day on the job, there was a really nice, well-meaning editor, but he was going around to all the different editors and departments and introducing me as, here's Maggie. She's our first Hispanic reporter. And I would do like a little slow burn. And then finally, I was really upset. So I went into Jack Driscoll, who was the managing editor. I went into his office and I said, Jack, did I get hired because I was a good reporter or because I was Hispanic? And Jack says, oh, of course, because you're a good reporter. Well, the truth of the matter is I didn't have the experience. You know, the reporters that they would hire on as full-time reporters were people that had a lot more experience. There was a wonderful woman named Ann Kirchheimer who spoke really good Spanish, and she had been covering the Latino community before. And so Ann stayed on, but you know, the idea was that they never told me that I was going to cover the Hispanic community, but that was their intention. I started to understand putting things together, which was perfectly fine. I mean, I never had a problem doing that because I found there were so many stories to cover that it was infinite. You know, I just felt like the sky was the limit. So, but I did feel that I didn't want to feel like I was the token brought in just to represent Hispanics. That I found really offensive. And if they had really thought about it, they could have hired. There was other Hispanic reporters who did have the experience they could have brought in. But it's kind of like they met me at a conference, they liked me, they said, you know, here's somebody who could do the job. And so the truth of the matter is, I learned a lot from that experience. I mean, I learned just about journalism, about writing. I had great editors. And, you know, I learned a lot about advocating, like, you know, some of the things you have to do in the newsroom, advocating for yourself.
Advocating in, for example, can you give some examples?
So, and I tell my students this all the time. I think that when you are really young, I think that there are people that will take advantage of that. They'll either see you as someone that they can push around, And so you really need to stand up for yourself in a number of different ways. So there would be an editor who wanted you to do, like, basically be their errand person, take notes for them like a stenographer, and you don't answer to them, you answer to the city desk. And so I was always really aware, and I was, maybe I had a chip on my shoulder, but it happened often enough, and it had started off at UPI, that I wasn't going to let that happen to me anymore, and I never did let that happen to me. I always advocated for myself, because I instinctively knew that if you don't stand up for yourself, there may be nobody else standing there. And people may not like you, but they'll respect you, and they're not going to, and you need to do it, because if you don't stand up for yourself, they're going to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing and seeing how far they can push you. So I think that was an important thing. So at the Boston Globe, one of the things that did happen to me that was like that moment of crystallization where you start to understand something at a very deep level. So I never had a problem covering Hispanics, never had a problem covering, any number of things. Loved doing it, in fact. So there was a story. I was going out to dinner one night. I had plans to go out to dinner with a friend of mine who was in town, and very last minute they had me a thing. They said, "Maggie, can you do this story?" So it meant I had to cancel my dinner plans. Fine, I'll go out. They said, "Go to Chelsea." Here's the story. The story was, there was a housing project in Chelsea, which was right outside of Boston. There was a Puerto Rican woman whose child had been kidnapped by a friend of the family. This woman who had been babysitting took the baby and never came back. 3 weeks later, the woman was found in Florida. And so the baby was unharmed. Wonderful. This is a happy story. So they want me to go to Chelsea and go interview the mom. So I go to Chelsea and go to the housing project where this woman lived. They were Puerto Rican, didn't speak any English, really poor. They were so poor they didn't have furniture. They had hard wooden chairs. That's what they had, like no couch. They had hard wooden chairs to sit on. They offered me a glass of water. That's all they had. So I interviewed them. It was the woman was very emotional, crying, but how happy she was. They were going to be returning the baby the next day or in a couple of days. So I go back and I said, "Wow, this is a really great story. It's a happy story." So as I wrote my story and gave it to the city desk, I said, "I hope this is going to get good play, because it's a good story." And they said, "Yeah, I'm sure it will get good play." Next day I couldn't find it. It was buried over in the obits. The pages where the obits are. And I went up to the city desk and I said, "I don't understand how this story got played next to the obits. It should have at least been the Metro front." And they said, "Well, it came in late." I said, "Yeah, but it came in late. You were expecting it to come in." And I also know that for big stories, they will change the thing. So they said, "Well, go talk to the city editor." So the city editor's name was Bill Miller. And so I go into Bill Miller's office and I say, "Bill, I don't understand how this happened." He says, "Well, same thing." I said, "No, but it was a big story, and it should have been on the front page. I mean, a kid was kidnapped and has been found, and this is a really great, important story." And then I had this moment where I realized that because she was poor and because she was Puerto Rican, that was why the story was not important. And I also understood that because she wasn't important, because she was poor and Hispanic, I wasn't important. And the stories I was working on were not important. And my people weren't important. So I said that to Bill Miller. And then I ran into the bathroom and I started crying. And I was crying. I was crying because I was so angry, because it was like it's taken me all these years to figure this out, right? So Gail Pollard, who was another reporter who was African American, came over to where I was, and I started crying, and I told her the whole story, and she said, "Maggie, that's the way it is. We're not important to them." And I really didn't quite understand. This is what structural racism is. It's built into the threads of our society. So it's not that somebody says consciously Hispanics and African Americans aren't important. It's just that's the way they think. So, and there was also the class part of it. So I went into, Tom Winship was then the editor. I went into his office and I told him what had happened. I said, the Boston Globe has too many middle class people working here. If they can't see a big story because this woman was poor, and I don't know that I brought up the race part of it, but I think the class part was every much as important as the race part of it. Because if this woman would have been a rich Puerto Rican woman, they probably would have been able to see the importance of it too. So that was kind of like my one of those epiphanies that you have, that it's kind of, I understand at a really deep level now. It's a really painful thing to kind of admit, and because I loved the Boston Globe and I loved my editors there, but I saw the limitations, and I think I still remain to this day. I still believe there has to be a way for us to understand each other beyond what the externalities are, beyond class and occupation and race, and gender. We have to be able to do that.
So how responsive were the leaders at the newsroom to this?
Not very. I think part of it was I was the only one. For a little while, they brought in a copy editor named Cheryl Brownstein Santiago, who was Puerto Rican, who remains a very good friend of mine to this day. So she lasted there one winter, and then she was from Miami. She's like, I'm out of here. I'm going to Miami. But I think part of it was that I was the only Hispanic. I was very, very close to the African American reporters there, and there was a couple of editors there. So kind of together, we did kind of try to create a little organization within the newsroom, and we did talk about some of the issues. And I think that we might have even had some meetings with the Globe editors. I don't remember what happened with that though. But I do have to say about the Boston Globe. So I got there in August, September of 1979, and right away, within the first couple of months, there was a breakfast meeting with members of the Hispanic community, and they all came in and they were loaded for bear. There was all kinds of stories that had been omitted by the Boston Globe or had not been covered by the Boston Globe. And by the time they came in, I had already been kind of like looking for stories in the Hispanic community. So I had proposed stories. I had been, some of my story ideas were rejected. And so the community came in and they were saying, so you didn't cover this. And so one of the editors turned to me and said, Maggie, were you aware of that story? I said, yes, I was aware of that story, and I proposed it, and I wasn't given the green light on it. And so it was kind of, I very much sided with the people in the community, and I always have. I've always sided with people in the community who say this news organization has not paid attention to our people, or they've gotten this wrong. I mean, usually when people complain, they have a really valid complaint. And so I've as much as I love the groups that I've worked with, the organizations I've worked with, I think that usually the complaints are pretty valid.
It's kind of a parenthesis.
I've got to ask you this first. If I have lipstick on my teeth or whoever, you need to let me know.
Okay.
Do I?
I cannot see very well from here.
Martine, do I have lipstick on my teeth? I can't hear you.
Everything looks good to me.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'll take this opportunity to take a breath. I was going to ask, the move, I already mentioned this when you were talking about Colombia. So you had already lived in New York in the Northeast.
Yes.
So how different was it, if at all, to work with a community that's a Latino community that's predominantly Puerto Rican in this case, as compared to Texas and South Texas?
I really felt an affinity to the people, the Puerto Rican people. And part of it was because I think Ann Kirchheimer, that other reporter, had done a really good job of cultivating sources. And so whenever I'd go out, I think people were much more open to meeting me. And they were very open to me. I mean, over and over again, I'd go out in the community. I would be looking for, I'd be talking to people, and they were very curious about what I was from. I don't know that they had ever met a Mexican American before, so they were curious about that. They did a story about me for one of the Latino newspapers there, because there were two different newspapers that were owned by two Cuban Americans. And so I started doing some of those stories. There's a big rift in the Cuban American community, the ones that were anti-CASA and the ones that were, let's go ahead and normalize relationships. And so I started doing some of those stories, and I felt really, I felt very welcome, and I never felt them saying, well, why did you get a Mexican American? Why didn't you get a Puerto Rican? Which I think that would be a very natural response to have, frankly.
So how long were you at the Boston Globe?
3 years.
3 years. So did this overlap with the first efforts to create?
Yeah. It was, let's see, in I guess it was in 81, was when we started planning the first Hispanic journalist conference. And so I was at the Globe at the time. And so as part of that, there was no infrastructure, like there's not organizations of Hispanic journalists. So what I started doing was I wrote letters and sent out letters to every Hispanic journalist in the Northeast that I knew. And I asked them to please make copies of the letter and send it to other people. And so that kind of started the snowball thing. So that was just to let people know about the conference. And from that, I actually started meeting people out in the Northeast a little bit more. So that was the first thing.
So taking a step back, so where did the idea for the conference come from?
I don't know that. I don't know how it came about. I just know that I was, and I don't remember how I was asked, but I was asked to be on this planning committee for this conference, and so I started getting, I wanted to make sure that people in the Northeast were aware of this, and so I started getting the word out.
So besides, spreading the word and inviting other people to collaborate, did you have a specific role in the actual event, in organizing the event?
Oh yeah, that was the whole thing. As I recall, but somebody will probably give you a better idea. As I recall, it took about a year to organize it, because we were organizing the panel discussions, finding the best speakers, and so it's everything that goes into doing a major conference. So it was going to be, I guess it was a 2-day conference in San Diego. So everything that's involved in that, I was part of that.
So what was the content? What were the main themes or the main?
I don't remember, and I don't know that I have a program from that first conference, but somebody out there does. So
did this process bring you in contact with other people who were interested in building an organization? Yeah, well, all some of the people that were on that first organizing committee for NHJ were on that conference committee. So we started, people like Norma Sosa, Paula Maez. We started talking, and those of us who were not in California, who were outside of California. So being in Boston, I felt a real need to connect with other Latinos, because there were so few of us in Boston. Toward the end, I started to meet more of my fellow Latino journalists. But when I first got there, there was not many of us there. So where were the others? In other media in Boston area? Some in the Boston area, yeah, greater Boston area, and they worked in television. Some of them worked in television. There was one that worked, his name is Saldivar. He worked at the Boston Herald, so we were competitors, so we would run into each other sometimes on assignments. I think he's based out of Washington, D.C. now, R.A. Saldivar. So you start bumping into people, and it's kind of usually the friendly competition kind of thing. Speaking about California, how much influence or contact did CCNMA have outside of California? I had not heard of CCNMA at the time. But they were before we started planning for the conference. I mean, once the conference planning started, because
CCNMA was one of the lead organizers. Yeah, then I started realizing, oh, they have an organization here. Okay.
So at what point during the organizing of the conference did the specific idea of let's make this an organization jump out, or was it?
You know, I don't know. For me, there wasn't one particular moment where this started, but because I had been involved here in UT with that, and I had seen that we were able to we were able to move the needle. I felt we were able to move the needle a little bit, and after that incident in Chicago where he says go start your own organization, that really did kind of leave a little bee in my bonnet that I felt that yeah, we should be starting our own organization. And so it was something that hadn't been at uppermost in my mind, but it had been back there, and it was something that I knew going into even the conference planning that at some point it's something that we really need to be doing. I'm not sure that I thought about the conference as being something that would usher that in, but as we started planning and we started to get to know each other and we realized there's people all over the country that look like us, then it started getting a little bit more exciting. Then at the conference itself, as I recall, we had something like 700 people there. So it was really empowering to see that many journalists who looked like you and had a last name like you, and to different degrees had experiences that were like yours. That was really empowering, and who had some of the same issues going on in their different communities. So it was kind of like, how much more obvious does it need to be? There is a critical mass here, and there is work that needs to get done, and we're the people that need to do that. So I've got to say, I left the Boston Globe in 1982 to come to Texas, back to Texas, and I ended up getting a job in Dallas at a television station, WFAA. So that was kind of, the other part of it was the conference came up after I had started working at WFAA in Dallas. So at the very first conference, Felix Gutierrez had called me like right at the beginning, and so I'm going from print into television to a major market television station. It was at the time the 8th largest market in the country. So, it was a huge adjustment for me. So Felix calls me and says, "Oh," he says, "how are you doing?" I said, "Wow, Felix, this is really hard. It's a huge adjustment for me." And he says, "Oh, I bet you you're the anchor by now." I said, "Only on weekends, ha ha ha." That was a joke, right? So when I went to get my badge, it said Maggie Rivas, weekend anchor. Who wrote this? It's like they really thought I was the weekend anchor. It was really funny.
What were you covering at WFAA?
It was general assignment.
Okay. And I don't want to confuse the timeline too much, but there was also an organization of Latino journalists in Dallas.
Yes, that was the DFW Network of Hispanic Communicators. And that had been started, I think, the year before I got to Dallas. So there was already an existing organization. So it was, that was really exciting. So I got, I plugged into them pretty quickly. And I started getting very involved in the organization and getting to meet people and stuff.
So what types of activities did the Dallas-Fort Worth Network do?
Well, once I got involved, my big thing, because I had been encouraged, I had gotten a lot of encouragement from the writing contests UIL writing contest that I was involved in. So I thought that the writing contest would be a really important thing to do. So that was like my first thing that I started doing was a writing contest for high school students. So, we would do writing contest. That was the big thing that we did. So we did a writing contest, and it was really successful. The Dallas Morning News was our biggest sponsor. They printed up all of our programs, and they got pictures of people. So So that was like the big thing that I got involved in.
And when did you join? 1982 as well?
I think pretty much as soon as I got there. I think it was kind of like, I think when I started, the Hispanic, those people there was a woman named Diana Navarrete, and she saw me on the air and she saw me in the newsroom. I don't know what her involvement was, but she said, "You've got to get involved." And so, okay, so I got involved.
All right. So going back to the big conference, to the 1982 conference. So there's this story that's mentioned in one of the retrospectives from NAHJ about this momentous dinner. So you were there, right?
Yeah.
So how did that go?
Well, I had those of us, the Paula Mayes and Norma Sosas of the world, and I had been talking about we really need to have an organization. And I don't remember who we talked to about it. And I don't remember who proposed it first. But at that dinner, what I do remember is CCNMA had been very reluctant to go this route. And I remember Jerry Sass standing up and basically saying, well, CCNMA, if you're not willing to help, then you need to step aside, because basically it's going to happen. And I think you could have heard a pin drop in the room, because we knew that what he was essentially doing was drawing a line in the sand and telling CCNMA, with or without you, it's going to happen. And really, CCNMA would not want to be left behind. This was too big. This was too big an effort to be left behind. And I think that, deep inside, they believed in everything that we believed in. I can understand where they were coming from. CCNMA had been working for a really long time. They had worked so hard at becoming what they had become. So to see this upstart national group walk in, and we're looking at some of the same funding sources, I can understand that they would not be thrilled about the idea, but I think that they came around, and they became, we became some of the best supporters, the best partners that we could have imagined.
So were you involved directly in one of these discussions where it became manifest that they were not fully on board at first?
My memories are really fuzzy about this. I know that it was always in the last several months before the conference. It was kind of in the background that this was kind of bubbling up, and that CCMA didn't want to do this. I think Henry Mendoza probably will be the best one to address that, because I really don't remember how it became very obvious that they were not going to be happy.
So at the end of the conference, everyone went back to your different cities, already with a plan to start building the organization, or what happened right after?
I don't remember. What how that turned out. I do remember that one of the first things I did was same thing as I had been doing in Boston when I wrote the letters to everybody that I knew that I could find. I started doing the same thing in Texas and sending out letters to people and saying, there's this movement afoot to start a national organization, and we want to make sure that you are aware of this and want to, invite you to be part of it. And I remember there was this one reporter in San Antonio named Frank Trejo, who was not the same Frank Trejo as the Frank Trejo in Dallas, Fort Worth, because later I knew Frank Trejo, who was a reporter for first the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and then later the Dallas Morning News, and who's one of my best friends. This was an older Frank Trejo, and I don't know what year he was, what years he worked at one of the two Dallas, San Antonio papers, but he wrote back to me, he says, "Dear Maggie, over the past 20 years, there have been at least 3 different attempts to begin a national Hispanic journalists organization. None of them have succeeded. Good luck. And that was it. And I remember being kind of like, well, just because nobody has succeeded doesn't mean you're not going to try. And he was very skeptical about it. So I can understand the skepticism, but I think that what he was not looking at was what we had been able to do with that major conference. If that conference had flopped, there would not be an NAHJ. But that conference was really successful, and it really said to the world, this is the power of these people. You know, this is something that people are willing to invest their time and their money into and make it succeed. So that was really important to basically kind of set the stage for what would become NAHJ.
How kind of a quick step back to the conference. So the conference, it was large, so there was a critical mass. So I would presume, but correct me if I'm wrong, it was also representative of the whole U.S. and different Latino communities? How diverse was it?
You know, I don't know that. I'm sure that we have registration records somewhere. I don't know that. I do know that we had some people. We had people from all over the country that went, and I'm sure that they were mainly concentrated in California because that was where it was. But I know that there were people from around the country that went. And I don't know, and this is an important thing to look at, is like how many, besides Hispanic journalists, how many of those ASNE types and Dow Jones types were involved in that. What I didn't tell you was that, you know, when I was in Boston, I started getting involved in kind of volunteer stuff, helping students. So the Dow Jones had this urban newspaper workshop for high school kids, and so for I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years, I was the lead instructor for that. So they would bring in, so basically instead of going to work, I would go and I would be the lead instructor for this high school journalism workshop, and I'd bring in different people. So there was kind of, you know, so that had been going on for a while. So it was important. The Dow Jones, you know, organization, Gannett, all of those people that had been helpful in supporting minorities' inclusion in the newsroom, I'd be interested in knowing how many of them went to the NAHJ conference. I suspect that a lot of them did. And that was really important. At the time, you know, diversity was something that had really erupted as being something really important to the news business. And so there was a vested interest in making sure that they had representation at that first conference.
Actually, I wanted to ask about that workshop. So how was that experience for you as a young journalist?
You know, it was all African American kids, and some of them were interested in journalism careers. I don't know that all of them were. You know, I think a lot of them were not interested in journalism careers, but they got front and center a chance to meet some of the people that were leaders in journalism in Boston. So I will never forget, you know, they had Marty Nolan, who was at the time, Marty Nolan was the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe. And Marty was a brilliant guy. And I remember his approach to talking to them was he spoke to them as if they were the same age and background as he was. And he said, we were talking about the news of the day, and he was saying, well, you know, that story does not have a long shelf life. And so, you know, students like, shelf life, what's that? So, you know, they got a chance to do that. But also, I also learned the things that you don't do. You don't sit somebody in front of these kids and have them just talk at them because their interest went like way down. So there had to be interaction. So it was kind of like one of the painful things was I remember one time having somebody, and it might have been Marty Nolan, but I had a student just sitting there listening to Marty Nolan and fall flat asleep when he was talking. I was like, no. But that's something that you learn from doing it and being a little bit embarrassed that, you know, the guest speakers don't get their full attention. So it was kind of it was a good thing for me to learn how to do. hopefully they got something out of it.
Did at that, well, I don't know. Did at that point, did you see yourself becoming an educator later on?
Oh no, 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 no. I was very much, I really was like a journalist through and through. I really thought I was gonna leave the newsroom on a stretcher because it's all I ever wanted to do. So
Okay. Before getting, more into detail about NAHJ and the foundation, uh, how diverse was WFAA?
WFAA, let's see. I was the only reporter. They had an African American anchor who was really good. They had cameramen who were Latino, or not Latino, but African American. They had one editor, because back then they had separate editors. You'd bring your tapes and log your tapes and write your script, and the editor would sit there and they would edit the tape, edit the story for you. So there was one Latino, but I was the only reporter. So I think that they would have liked to have groomed me to do something like be an anchor or something, but I wasn't really.
Yes, I was in part asking that because there was, for example, in Dallas, there was the critical mass of Latino media professionals to create an organization.
Yeah, and every station had at least one reporter. And I think that there was the newspapers, had the same thing. I mean, at the time, a critical mass. It wasn't really a critical mass. It was like every station had one reporter. Newspapers may have one reporter, and that was it. And there was nobody in an editing position when I first got there. Later on, there were people that were like assistant state editors of the newspaper, but they kind of thought, we got the feeling, they thought they had it made if they just had one reporter and that would be it. And again, the same thing was, they were very receptive to stories about Latinos. So they did carry those stories, but there were never people in positions of authority, and that was an important thing. And I've got to say something about the Boston Globe. So the Boston Globe, I'm their first Hispanic reporter. I keep on giving them names of people that I would meet, and I'd say, you've got to bring this person in. They're really great. They're really, they're good reporters. They're smart. They're all this stuff. And they'd say, oh yeah, that's good, good. So the day that I went in to turn in my letter of resignation was the day the city editor said, Maggie, let's go have lunch and talk about how we can bring in another Hispanic reporter. So basically, as long as they had that one spot filled, they didn't care. They thought that was going to be enough. And so I kind of felt the same way about other places that I worked.
Okay. So going back, so the conference had passed. You were contacting other people to invite them to participate in the creation of the organization. What was the main argument, or what was the selling point of a national organization of Latino journalists? Why was it necessary? How did you?
I don't know how we framed it. I would write these letters, but I don't remember how I framed it. I will tell you that from my standpoint, there were at least 3 issues. One was getting more people into the newsrooms. Like I say, I was the only Hispanic reporter at the Boston Globe, and they weren't going to replace me until after I was gone. Over and over again. So bringing more people into the newsroom and also getting them promoted. So we wanted, it became very obvious that you need to have the gatekeepers too. You need to have people who are going to be in positions where they can actually not just you write all the stories, but you can also get other people to write the stories. So that was an important thing. So that was one thing, getting more people into the newsroom, getting more people into journalism. So encouraging young people to see that as an option, that they don't have to think, oh, I'm going to be a nurse, but in the evenings I'll write short stories. No, actually, there are jobs in journalism. You can do this for a living. And then the other thing was to ensure fair and accurate treatment of Latinos. And over again, the same thing with the Puerto Rican mom whose kid had been kidnapped. You know, was it fair to have her story on the inside, buried near the obituaries? No, that should have been a front page story.
So at what point were you invited to be a member of the founding committee?
I don't remember how that came about. I don't remember if it was, there at the conference or when it was. Um, but I had this real feeling of history was being made. I did have that feeling from the beginning, because I understood that we could make a really big difference, and that we weren't going to just let other people take care of our needs. We were taking care of our needs. So at the time I thought it was a historic thing, but then later on I realized it's not only historic, but it really does need to be chronicled in some way.
I'll take a pause to change pages. So then the meetings started, and people started, writing bylaws and all of that. What do you remember about that period, that process?
I remember there continued to be this friction, tension about the role of CCNMA in the creation of NAHJ. Because I remember at a meeting that we had, we would travel all over the country, and we would have these meetings with the local journalists. And so we went to Miami at this one point, and we were in Miami, and they would have the committee members in kind of a U-shaped table, and then they would have all the local journalists kind of in the audience. And we would kind of give an whoever would give an overview of what we're doing, and we would say what we've done, we would say what we want to do, and then we'd leave it open to questions and comments from the audience. And I remember one of the committee members saying, and CCNMA was the one who organized NAHJ. And I remember that some of us looked at each other like, no, that's not how it happened. It's like, excuse me, let me just correct for the record, CCNMA is not responsible for the creation of NHJ, but they were instrumental. Because if CCNMA had not already had a very strong infrastructure, that first conference would not have been as successful as it was. Trying to have it in Dallas, it would have been a different conference. I think that because CCNMA they did have numbers in California, in Southern California. We didn't have those numbers in Dallas. And probably I think that Dallas would have been the most likely place. San Antonio maybe to another extent, because they also had more members there, but they weren't organized.
So what you mentioned already, the role of CCNMA, that was a contentious point. What other main issues were like in?
Well, when you're talking about planning out NHJ. Okay, so one of them was who gets to vote. So the question is, Felix Gutierrez had long been one of my mentors. And one of the proposals was that academic members would not be able to hold office. I think that there were lots of different variations. One of them was they could vote but not hold office. They could be members but they couldn't vote. I think there were different proposals. And so in the end, it was decided that they could not hold office. And I thought that was an oversight. I thought that was a mistake, because somebody like, and now I think even more so, because if you teach journalism, you are in a position to influence a lot of lives and not just your students' lives, former students' lives. You know, you're called on to be a community leader, whether you like it or not. You are a community leader, and I think that people like that should be given an opportunity to serve on a board. Now they are again. Now there's a board member, a position for an academic representative. So I'm glad about that. But that was one of the issues. And there were some people that were real purists, and very much only people that are from these particular kinds of news media could be this and could be that, and I remember that those were some of the biggest arguments we had. You know,
Who else? What other type of media professional was excluded at first, or
PR. Yeah, that was one of the other arguments was, you know, public relations professionals. And I think that one wasn't as, that one makes a little bit more sense to me, because I do think that, you know, there's a lot of commonality between journalism and PR, but then at a certain point there is none. There's, you know, it does split up, and so that one was one that I could, you know, I agreed with that one. So that was one. And then the issue of Spanish language news outlets also became one. And that one I don't remember the particulars. I don't remember who was on which side of this issue. I do remember that it became pretty heated because there were some people who said that that there were a lot of instances where the Spanish language news media didn't have the same standards as the, you know, English language mainstream news media. And I don't remember who made which argument. I don't remember how I felt along those lines. I do think that I probably have changed my views on some of these issues over the years, because it is true that there is some smaller news outlets that have different criteria, but now, especially today, you see even some larger ones that have very questionable criteria and principles. So yeah.
so in that case it was an issue with the membership of people who work there, or what was that?
I don't remember if it was who was going to serve on the board of directors, because we wanted to have regional representation, and then we wanted to have at-large board members, and then we wanted to have people that would, you know, we would make sure that somebody was representing broadcast and representing print.
Was the ethnic or national origin at any point an issue, like the proportion, like for example, not having too many Mexican Americans as opposed to Puerto Ricans or Cuban Americans, or vice versa?
You know, I don't remember it being. It wasn't for me. We were conscious of that. We wanted to make sure to have Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans. That was kind of intentional, that we needed to have that kind of thing. We didn't want it to be a National Association of Mexican American journalists or Puerto Rican journalists. The larger number, just numerically, of our population is Mexican American, so it makes sense that you'd have more representation from Mexican Americans. But we wanted to really fully integrate all of the Latino groups, and I felt a strong, like I say, I felt a very strong affinity to the other Latino groups.
And I think I remember from looking at the roster, but the people involved, the leadership in the organizing committee were U.S. People who studied and work in the U.S. As opposed to Latin American journalists.
Yeah.
Okay. Was that also ever an issue? Like, for example, the fact that some media professionals had just moved and were trained somewhere else, or that kind of thing?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't remember us discussing this very fully, but probably Guillermo Martinez might be a better person to address that. One of the issues back then and even today remains that, particularly, well, in Spanish language news, oftentimes the people that get the jobs are not U.S. Latinos, but they are, people who were Latinos born outside of the U.S. who come here. And the problem that I see, that a lot of people see, is that they have a different experience. Their background is different. So they may not be plugged into the everyday life of U.S. Latinos. So that is an important perspective to include. But I don't remember us having those discussions.
And kind of in the same note, was there an issue with the inclusion of Puerto Rico, of the island itself, with its own media system?
I don't think that we ever argued about that. I mean, I'm sure Jesus Davila was very aware of it. Juan Gonzalez was very aware of it. We always had people from El Diario. Is that the Puerto Rican, the one in San Juan? The San Juan Star. Well, we had people who worked at the San Juan Star who were active in NHJ, and one of our conferences was in Puerto Rico. I forget what year that was, but yeah.
And how about connections with Latin American media? I mean, I know NHJ had recently a conference in Mexico City. Was any of this like in the works back then, or was that in the radar?
It wasn't in the works, but there was another conference that took place in Mexico at one point. And the problem this is not going to be necessarily for your dissertation, but that was very controversial. And the reason it was very controversial is because the Mexican government paid for it. And this is the same Mexican government who has so opposed freedom of the press. And so that was very controversial. A lot of people just could not go to that.
What was this in the first decade, in the 80s?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll look into that too. So this was a heavy time commitment. This required a lot of time.
Yeah.
And so how did you juggle that with working as a reporter for the TV station in Dallas?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a heavy time commitment, and I was also very active in the DFW network of Hispanic communicators. So yeah, it was like two pretty big pastimes. I won't call them hobbies because I don't think that makes it seem very serious, but they were two serious pastimes. I remember one time having a discussion with Frank Sotomayor, who you'll meet in Tucson, and this was after I had already been organizing one of the writing contests or something for NAHJ. And Frank said something to the effect that, well, it's important to, work on your career and get your career established, and then you do all these things. And I looked at him and I said, why? Because I think that was something for me. That I think I did take time away from what could have been my career to spend it on this. For one thing, I really love doing it. I love doing it, something that I could commit to this completely. I saw the need for it, and I felt like it was very, very rewarding. So yeah, I think I did, I did, my career was kind of like not front and foremost. It was some of these other things, because I thought and I continue to believe that you kind of have to think about what are you doing here? What are you really accomplishing in life? So at the end, what are you going to leave behind? I mean, not that I ever gave short shrift to my job, but I could have been doing other things for career advancement that I didn't do, and I was spending my time elsewhere.
Were they supportive?
Yeah, they really were. Yeah, both of, when I was working at WFAA, a lot of times I would have to take off a day here, a day there to go to a meeting, and the Dallas Morning News was remarkably supportive, remarkably, and I think that's largely because the top editors, believed in the idea of diversity, so they saw this as very much in keeping with their commitment to diversity.
Also, you were the president of the Dallas organization,
I was
right?
for
Around
1 or 2 years, yeah. And I remember, I mean, I got so enmeshed in it. Oh my gosh, I was so enmeshed in it that I remember telling somebody, I think the only way that I can get out of this is to move. And so I did. I ended up moving to El Paso. It wasn't to get away from the local group, but you know, I ended up getting a little bit burnt out from it.
one thing I didn't ask. So the founding committee, the leadership that created the NHA, were aware of trying to pay attention, for example, to national origin. How about gender?
Well, that's a really, really good question. At our first conference, at that first conference, you know, and I was working on this, and so were Paula and Norma, and I forget who else was. There were some other people that were involved in the planning committee that were not on the for the conference, that were not on the NHJ committee, founding committee. But I mean, we were working on this thing, and we weren't counting how many women were on the panel discussions and how many speakers there were. We just kind of lost sight of it. And so at the one of the final banquets, one of the women conference participants stood up and said that she was really offended that there weren't more women on the panel discussions and as speakers. And she was absolutely right. There weren't. And it wasn't, you know, from malice. It was just, we were so busy trying to put all those other things together that we didn't step back and look at the gender representation. So yeah, shame on us.
But that changed right there and then.
Yeah, absolutely. Then we became uber, you know, conscious of it. So we always made sure to do that.
Okay. So at last, the bylaws were decided on and signed in 1984, correct?
I think so. Yeah.
And then there was the need to first create the first board of directors, right, and name the officers. How was that process?
Oh man, I don't remember that stuff. I really don't.
But you were in the board of directors at the beginning?
I was. I ran for, I think I was at large.
In these first stages, what were the main things that you were facing as an organization?
Probably some of the same things that we had been looking at from the very beginning, but you know, look at some archival stuff. You know, some of the same things. You know, fair and accurate treatment of Hispanics. But you know, one thing that I was always committed to, and kind of what I saw my role in all of this was to create some of those programs, and so, and especially the programs to get more young people into looking at them, at journalism as an option. So you know, we created a writing contest, and then we created a writing contest in Spanish. Julio Moran was the one who said you should have it in Spanish too. It's like, oh man, one more thing. So we ended okay, Spanish and English language writing contests, and that was a huge project that took a lot of time. And then later on, we did the conference newspaper in 1988. So those were kind of the things that I was always committed to doing things like that, because I feel that it's not enough for us to have job security and have all the perks. We need to bring in the younger people and get them and train them in a smart way, so that over and over again I've had people say, oh, I can't find a Hispanic to do this. I can't find a Hispanic or a qualified Hispanic. You know, whenever somebody says that, you can go back and you can look at the civil rights writings from the 1960s, and you can find the same exact arguments. I can't find anybody. I can't find a qualified person. So one time I had this one young man. His name was John Mir. He was from El Paso, and he was on our first Hispanic Latino reporter. So John told me that he had applied for a job in a newspaper in Delaware, and they told him, and he got the job, and they said, John, you're really lucky that we hired you, because a few years ago we had this other Hispanic reporter and he was terrible. You know, I don't remember if they had to fire him or whatever, but you're really lucky that we've hired you. And John told me and he was like proud of himself. I said, John, that's an insult. You didn't tell him, gee, I've worked with all these white editors and they were real jerks to me and some of them didn't know what they were doing, but you're really lucky that I don't think of you as just another white editor, you know, because it's the same thing. We are expected to all speak for all of our people over and over again, and it's really unfair. It's really unfair to us, and we should never let anybody say that to us. So the same stuff, you know, kept on going on for years and years.
Are you still good? Do you want to take a break?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask, more, you know, a little bit more about the Latino Reporter. Like, how did that idea, that specific idea, come about, and how did the first edition go?
Okay. So, you know, in 1988, we had the NAHJ conference in Dallas. So there was an existing group of Hispanic journalists and the network. And so Ernie Sotomayor was going to be, who's now at Columbia, he's the head of admissions at Columbia. He was going to be, he was one of the, I don't know if he was the chairman or the co-chair of the conference. And so we would meet every week. We'd meet for several months planning out this conference because we wanted to be the best NHJ conference you could ever have. And so what are we going to do in 1988 that would be different and better than what's happened before? And so Ernie and I had both worked at another program out of Berkeley, California. Now it's called the Maynard Institute. And what it would do is they would bring in older people who had been wanting to be journalists but hadn't been able. So it was basically a boot camp, a summer-long boot camp. So Ernie had been the director. I went there and I taught for 3 summers, and they would produce a newspaper. The newspaper was really, really great. And I had done these, you know, I did it in New York at Columbia too. It was a really effective way for people to learn how to do this. And so I really don't remember if it was Ernie's idea or my idea, but at one of these weekly meetings, we said we should do a newspaper. It would make more sense for Ernie to have done the newspaper because he had the production background. I had never done any, I had been a reporter. We don't have any production skills. We know how to write a story and send it to our editors, and that's it. We don't. Some of us knew how to take pictures. So we had to learn, first we had to secure, like, who's going to print it. I asked the Dallas Morning News. The Dallas Morning News said they were already giving us a lot. And they were giving me off, you know, they'd given me a lot of time off to work on stuff. So they said, no, they wouldn't print it for us. So we're trying to figure out, well, how are we going to get this thing printed? And at one of the meetings, Larry O'Donnell, who was then the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, happened to hear about this and said, oh, well, we have a Wall Street Journal printing plant in Dallas. They can print it. So that's how we got it printed through them. So I didn't know. I mean, so we rented Apple Mac computers with little places, slots to put in things. We had, I figured out the first issue, the advance issue, and recruited people from around the country to write stories and send in pictures. And then we had to take the hard copy. This is before email. They had to get the hard copy of the stories and type it in. And then get it, you know, printed up and stuff. So I worked with a couple of people from the Times Herald, a copy editor and a printer. And we had an office. Bilo had given the network an office on the 3rd floor of this tower in front of the Dallas Morning News. So we spent several weekends typing stuff up, getting it printed up, getting it, you know, laid out and stuff. Took it to the Wall Street Journal printing press, and the first issues like flew off because it was too lightweight. So I forget what they had to do, if we had to make it thicker, add more pages or whatever. And that first issue also had a bunch of mistakes in it. It was so embarrassing. So embarrassing. There's so typos all over the place. So I called the guy who was our guy over there, and I said, listen, I said, thank you so, and they printed like 3,000 or something for us, right? I said, thank you so much for printing these up. I said, and I want you to know that they had a lot of mistakes in it, and our next issues are going to be better. You know, we're better than that. He says, we can print it over for you. I said, are you serious? He said, yes. So we went back and we redid everything. So there was a couple of days that I would show up to work at the Dallas Morning News. I would go straight from over there, pull in all night over print worth newspaper, and I'd go to the morning news, and I'd go on my desk, and I'd fall asleep on my desk. I had what do you call it? A bag to sleep in. What do they call it? A sleeping bag. Sleeping bag at the office, because we were like, trying to get this thing. And then we had to redo everything. So it was horrible. It was like a really very, very tough thing. But the beauty was, we set up a newsroom at this hotel, and we had students. We recruited the students. Veronica, now Paniagua, her name at the time was Flores, now Paniagua, who's now an editorial page editor for the Houston Chronicle, was one of the students there. And so we had this great group of students working with us, and a bunch of professionals, and we put out, but we kept on knocking the deadlines. The deadline would be like 10 o'clock. I'd call them, I'd say, it's going to be late. It would be like 3 o'clock in the morning, and there we are taking the newspaper. So it was a lot more work, and especially it was a lot more work because we were dealing with these students, and they were, very inexperienced, and we'd have professionals working with them. We didn't have enough professionals, and so that was the biggest thing, is trying to work with students and help them. It was a learning experience. So they learned how to write stories. We learned how to do a better job, and it really was one of those things that gave me a lot of confidence that I could figure out how to do something kind of complex. And that was 1988. So from that, it's kind of like I didn't want to go back, and I was a business reporter at the Dallas Morning News writing about housing stuff. I didn't want to do that anymore. So it gave me the confidence to try something new and really get out of my comfort zone.
So you did that for several years, right?
Yeah, I mean, off and on, I don't remember how many years I did it, but several years. And then in 1995, I went back in El Paso, and we did it another time.
Okay. So, well, you already mentioned one of your former students from the Latino Reporter is now at the Chronicle in Houston.
Yeah.
What was the result? How do you run into your former students still? Do you?
A few of them. Let's see. So some of the people, like the ones who are the lead writers and editors, not writers but editors, we got to be very, very close, and I still remain there. It's kind of, it was a very intense time, and we got to just be very, very close friends and really respect each other tremendously. So Ernie's one of those people that Ernie kept on coming down, and it was a big hit, Conference newspapers like this. There had been another conference newspaper. AS&E had done a conference newspaper at one point, but they didn't produce it on site, and it wasn't produced with professionals working with students. So it was, in a lot of ways, we were breaking some new ground, and so we got like this, tremendous support from everybody at this conference, and they kept on wanting me to go and, take a bow and stuff, and I'd say, I'm busy. I'm putting out a newspaper. I don't have time to do that. And Ernie still told me, Maggie, you've got to come. I'm too busy. I don't have time. So finally, I went and I did my little song and dance in front of the crowd, and yeah, it was very well received, and people did things like sending us fruit baskets and things like that. So it was really cool.
So did you after your So you were in the board of directors for one term?
No, it was a few terms, but I don't remember, and I think I've got it in my resume. I don't remember how many terms, but I was at large, and at least for a couple of terms.
Did you consider becoming an officer?
Not really. I kind of, I don't feel the need to do those things. The things that what I get satisfaction out of, I get satisfaction out of creating programs and seeing them through and creating something like that. I really don't get a lot of satisfaction from that kind of thing.
So what has been the extent, I mean, beside the Latino Reporter, which you've done several times, what has been your involvement with the organization since the beginning?
Well, the writing contest was one thing. The Latino Reporter was the other. I still go to conferences when I can. Unfortunately, they're usually at the same time as AEJ, so I need to ask them to please move that because it's killing some of us. And locally there's a new NHJ chapter, so I'm kind of somewhat involved. I've gone to a couple of meetings anyway.
So, looking back, so what do you think? How do you feel about the 30 plus years of NHJ in terms of has it met what you envisioned, your expectations about the organization?
Yes and no. I think where it has succeeded has been in terms of bringing people in and giving them platforms they wouldn't have had otherwise. Norma Sosa, and I don't remember if it was the booklet that I gave you or another one, but she said that, here's Norma Sosa is one of the smartest people I've ever met. She was working at the Wall Street Journal, worked at the New York Times, and she said that she was at NHJ and we were planning it out and people would listen to her opinions, and that she was really struck by that because people hadn't listened to her opinions before. So I think that's really an important thing, and shame on people for not listening to Norma before this. But I think that has been individually, it's made a big difference in a lot of people's lives. I think, for those people who have become more involved and have taken on things, like there's a guy named Maclovio Perez, who's a weatherman in Corpus Christi, remains a very, very good friend of mine. He does this thing every year where he watches people's audition tapes and gives them critiques. Every year he's been doing that for 1 million years. He's made a difference in those people's lives. So to the degree that it's led to better professionalism, Ernie Sotomayor has done a bunch of programming where you do these pre-conference workshops to try to teach people new skills, and that's made a big difference. So those things have really been important. Where I think that NHJ has fallen down on the job, I am really sorry to say, I am really, really sincerely sorry to say, is, that evening when Charlie Erickson and I were put on the Hall of Fame, although we both were already on the Hall of Fame, recognized in some way in San Antonio a couple of years ago, and they gave awards to the sponsors. That was one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen in my life. We started out as being very serious journalists and people who wouldn't be bought off. And I know that NHJ has gone through some very tough times financially. I know that. But if you're not true to your principles, if you're going to be bought by, what was it, Fox Latino, then what are we after all? I mean, at the heart of it, we have to be journalists. And being a journalist means that you don't give a freaking award to somebody because they gave you money. I mean, it's very political. I see that all the time. I'm here at UT. At UT Austin, we regularly do this. All the people in those positions, they regularly give each other awards just for giving them money. I understand that. But as journalists, I think that we're better than that. And I think that we're selling ourselves short. So short term, you may get a few $1,000s from one of those news organizations, but long term, you're losing your credibility. And I would much rather have conferences where you don't have a bunch of meals, where it's really bare bones, but you're still hanging on to being serious journalists. I would much rather have that. So I think that it lost its way a little bit. I also started seeing, early on, this. Those people that were on that founding committee, I can say that every single one of them, we're doing it for career purposes. This was not something that, the Dallas Morning News or WFAA was not going to give me a promotion because I was on their board of directors. That was not even in our thinking. And as we progressed, I started realizing that a lot of the people that were doing it were doing it for just that reason. They were doing it because it was going to elevate them to in some way in the newsroom. And I started feeling like for some of those people, that was their reason for being on the board of directors. They weren't doing anything except for going to meetings and then saying that this is what they were doing. And so I saw that, and that broke my heart. Frankly, that broke my heart. So I don't know. I don't know if I suppose this should have been expected, but I guess I was really naive, and I really thought, everybody who's going to be coming along behind us is going to be really serious about journalism and really serious about doing all of those things that we started off wanting to do.
What would it take to return to the original purpose?
I think we're like today, I think that we're closer to it than we were a couple of years ago. I see some of the posts. I do think that we need to be tougher. We're still in a position where how many newspaper editors do we have, Latino newspaper editors do we have right now? Very, very few. Very, very few. And we're not demanding that. The numbers keep on falling. Diversity is like way down there, News organizations don't even pay it lip service. Used to be they would at least pay lip service. Now they're just they're in survival mode, so they're not even paying attention. So I think that we can still hold their feet to the fire, and we're not doing that. We're not writing strongly worded letters when something happens all the time. Sometimes we do, but oftentimes it's kind of like we're reacting after other groups have already done it, then NHJ piles in and starts doing it too. I would love to see us be, really tough and say, yeah, this is wrong, and take bold stands. Take really bold stands. People love it. The people that are rank and file members, people like me now, we love it. We love it when leadership takes strong stances and says, we're not going to take this crap anymore.
How did being a founder and member of NAJ change you in particular, individually?
Let's see. I think it gave me a different perspective than I would have otherwise. I think, organizing an organization, after I did that, then there's been a couple of other times when I've actually been involved in either advising other people to create their own organization. So I kind of have an idea of what's needed. It's probably made a big difference to me as far as my approach to this project, to the Voces Oral History Project, because I see kind of like how is this, keeping really focused on what your main mission is, staying true to that. I think it made me think through codes of ethics that I hadn't before. Before I was on the NHJ board, I don't know that I had ever read an entire code of ethics of any organization. So because of that, and I wasn't one of the people, Norma Sosa, Juan, and I think Charlie were the ones that were leading the discussion on the codes of ethics. Well, once that happened, then I really started reading these, and I started realizing, kind of really thinking through and understanding at a much deeper level what I was doing on a daily basis as a journalist. So, it helped me become a better journalist in a lot of ways. And then on a personal level, I just have very deep friendships with people that came through.
and from the perspective of a professor, a journalism professor, uh, does do you see NHA membership or participation helping students, for example?
Definitely. And you know what, kind of one of the things that I've been a little bit frustrated about is that we don't have more students that apply to the NHJ projects. Because now it's not just, there's they don't, I don't think they produce an actual paper one. They just have an online, a web thing. And then they have a radio one. I think they still have a television one. And it's a great opportunity for people to learn how to do things. I would not mind going back. I would not mind going back and just being one of the regular volunteers to work on this stuff. But there's great opportunities. There's scholarships. There's internships that you can do through NHJ. So it's helped me kind of want students to get more involved. Also, nobody's going to do it for you. And so I've had other students come and say, we think that the journalism department should start X kind of organization for us. And I'm going, it's not how it works. Nobody can start an organization for you. That's the reason they call it an organization. You organize it. You might be able to get some funding from somebody else, but you organize it. And that's the whole thing. It's a lot of work to do it, but that way it's yours. It's not somebody else imposing it from on top.
Speaking of responsibility, and this is not necessarily NHG related, but talking about Latino journalists and Latino journalism in general, what's the role of the universities in if the industry is kind of backing away from a commitment, so what can universities and journalism schools do?
Well, I think we can continue, and newspapers aren't going to say they're not interested. They're not going to say that. They're still going to say they're interested. They're just not going to do anything. So I think that we can kind of continue to raise the issue and not let it die. And the Trailblazers thing, the other oral history, that's part of that. Part of it is just kind of keeping the heat on and not letting it go by the wayside. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and I've always believed this, we need to prepare our students to be the best journalists that they, possible. So same thing as when they were saying, this is our first Hispanic reporter. They are Hispanics maybe, but they're also journalists. And there should not be. So say that you have 6 Hispanic journalists in a newsroom, and they have a 7th, you have another job opening. So what? You have 8 Hispanic journalists. There should not be just like one reservation for one Hispanic journalist. There should be more. So just giving them all the tools they can to set the world on fire, because they should be very competitive going out the door.
Is there anything you would like to add?
I don't think so.